Thank you. Thank you. Columbia University President Mr. Lee Bollinger and Mrs. Jean Magnano Bollinger. Secretary Albert Rosario, Ambassador Joey Quisha, Ambassador Philip Goldberg, Secretary Cesar Purisima, Secretary Corazon Soliman, Secretary Gregory Domingo, Secretary Arsenio Balisacan, Secretary Jose Renel Medras, Secretary Julia Bad, Secretary Herminio Coloma Jr., Consul General Mario De Leon, faculty, staff, and students of Columbia University, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. 42 years ago today, Ferdinand Marcos appeared on television to announce the imposition of martial law. I was 12 years old when martial law was declared in the Philippines, ushering about 14 years of dictatorship. At that time, perhaps, I was unable to understand in full the gravity of the situation. What I understood, however, was that my father, then Senator Benigno S. Aquino Jr., was arrested and imprisoned, all because Ferdinand Marcos feared my father's unflagging courage in speaking out against the abuses of the dictatorship. It did not take long before the rest of the Philippines felt the grip of authoritarian rule. Soldiers and checkpoints filled the streets. Media outlets were turned into propaganda machines. Anyone could be thrown in jail for expressing an opinion against the government. Under Mr. Marcos, the freedom that our forefathers fought and died for became a seemingly impossible dream. My family gained a brief respite when my father was allowed to receive medical treatment in Dallas and eventually settled in Boston. We lived there for 3 years as a normal family in the midst of what can only be described as an abnormal situation back home. But my father, knowing that the dictator was surrounded by flatterers and sycophants, believed that Mr. Marcos might have increasingly become detached from reality. He remained hopeful, however, for a dialogue, wanting to lay down the real situation to the dictator, how our people had grown so disillusioned that even previously moderate actors were turning towards militancy, and how civil war was becoming a real possibility in our country. My father chose to return to the Philippines, and as he alighted from the airplane, before even setting foot on Philippine soil, he was assassinated. His death ignited a nonviolent movement that would culminate in the EDSA People Power Revolution, so named for the millions who crowded EDSA, one of our country's major thoroughfares. There, tanks and armed soldiers were sent. They were met with the prayers and songs of millions who believed in democracy, in the future of the Philippines, and in the power of the ordinary citizen. My mother, Corazon Aquino, was one such citizen who rose to the task of restoring democracy to the Philippines and nurturing it after the end of martial law. My father once said that the Filipino is worth dying for. Through the difficult years of my mother's presidency, she in turn devoted herself to proving that the Filipino was also worth living for. Unfortunately, not all presidents who followed my mother shared their belief. To some, democracy was a tool to be manipulated. Power was a seat to be claimed from which one could impose his or her own will upon the people. This was most apparent in the 9.5-year administration of my predecessor. Instead of learning the lessons of history under the dictatorship, she seemed to have taken a course on how to abuse the system, straight from Mr. Marcos's playbook. Through the years of the lost decade, the government decayed, weakened by corruption and impunity. Businesses became more afraid to invest in the Philippines for lack of a level playing field and stability in the political climate. The Filipino people once again lost hope in the prospects of the country. Many sought greener pastures abroad. Yet there were some who remained hopeful for the Philippines, as my father believed, and as he would have said in his arrival statement had he not been assassinated. And I quote, "Yes, the Filipino is patient, but there is a limit to his patience," close quote. The Filipino people reached that limit once again in 2010. In another strong display of people power, they filled the polling stations and voted for the primary ideal behind our campaign, which was, where there is no corruption, there will be no poverty. Now I stand there as president of a country that has risen from the ashes of a lost decade. From day one, we have strived to render true service to our people, to grant them once more the capacity to hope. Allow me to give a few examples of the challenges we have had to face and the steps we took and are continuing to take to surmount these challenges. As our campaign battle cry made evident, the first challenge was to restore integrity to government. The playing field was skewed towards the favored few. To level it meant holding to account those who had exploited the system for personal gain. For example, when evidence was found implicating my predecessor, plunder charges were filed against her, and she was arrested. When it was proven that the Chief Justice of our Supreme Court, supposedly the foremost guardian of our Constitution, had violated it by failing to declare 98% of his assets in his Statement of Assets, Liabilities, and Net Worth, fellow reformists in the legislature removed him from office. When evidence of plunder came up against three incumbent senators, they were placed in detention, where today they face plunder charges which are non-bailable. The message is clear. Gone are the days when money, power, and influence determined one's innocence or guilt. The second challenge ran parallel with the first. Along with holding public officials or erring public officials to account, there was also the need to pursue large-scale reforms in agencies whose names had become synonymous with corruption. Agencies such as our Department of Public Works and Highways underwent a massive transformation. Paperwork was cut down and bidding procedures were simplified. These had the dual effect of minimizing opportunities for corruption and attracting even more bidders. These reforms have also allowed our DPWH to save around 28 billion pesos, equivalent to around $628 million, which then could be used to fund the next phases of the projects previously approved by Congress. Reforms plugged the leakages in the system and made for a more efficient bureaucracy. These freed up resources, which allowed us to respond to the third challenge. For a long time, social services were used not as a means of empowering the people, but as a tool for political patronage. Our health and education systems were in a dismal state, and the poor could not even begin to dream of breaking the cycle of intergenerational poverty. This has changed. From the beginning, we channeled our resources to the wisest possible investment, which is the Filipino people. Under our watch, budgets for social welfare, education, and health increased in multiples. Our flagship initiative, a conditional cash transfer program, targeted at the poorest of the poor, the primary condition being that they should ensure that their children attend school. And now, we have acquired the wherewithal to expand this program further to include families with children up to 18 years of age. This is because of a study showing that our high school graduates earn 40% more than those who only finished the elementary years. On top of this, critical resource gaps in education were bridged. Backlogs in classrooms, school seats, and textbooks were all addressed within 3 years of our term. Lead agencies for education and skills training linked with private industry to find out which sectors held the most opportunities, then proceeded to train Filipinos and help them find employment. For health, we expanded the scope and coverage of our government health insurance system. Now it covers both the most common ailments and the diseases that are most catastrophic to Filipino families, including leukemia and breast cancer, amongst others. The fourth challenge has to do with addressing our vulnerabilities. An average of 20 tropical storms enter the Philippine area of responsibility every year. Recent years, however, have shown us an alarming turn of events, what we refer to as the new normal, of increasingly strong storms arriving at increasingly close intervals, even coming out of season. This presents a problem. For example, for agriculture, a sector so weather-dependent, that erratic weather patterns wreak havoc on the planting and harvesting seasons, and therefore on the lives of our farmers. This is on top of the massive destruction that some typhoons cause. This is why, from the beginning of our administration, we have equipped ourselves with the wherewithal to minimize the damage wrought by these storms in the Philippines. These have come in the form of Doppler radars strategically placed around the country, hydrometeorological devices, and early warning systems, along with a website through which Filipinos can access real-time weather information. Storm and rainfall warnings are regularly sent out to the public hours, if not days ahead of time. Every effort has been made to maximize the security and preparedness of every single citizen. The reality, though, is that no single nation can confront the problem of climate change alone. This was the painful lesson that Typhoon Haiyan taught us in late 2013. As I put forward during the UN Climate Change Summit earlier today, it would not be an exaggeration to say that developing countries such as the Philippines bear a disproportionate amount of vulnerability. We believe that it will take a concerted global effort to rise to what is perhaps the most significant challenge of our time, and the Philippines is ready to fulfill its fair role in this. Dismantling the culture of corruption, establishing a level playing field, strategically investing in the people and addressing their vulnerabilities have allowed the Philippines to realize its long dormant economic potential. Average growth from 2010 to 2013 under administration was pegged at 6.3%. To compare, from 2006 to 2009, economic growth was pegged at only 4.3%. Since we came into office, there have been 20 positive credit ratings actions directed at the Philippines. In 2013, all three major credit rating agencies were unanimous in upgrading the Philippines to investment grade, the first time that this had ever happened in our history. These ratings actions come at a time of greater conservatism for these ratings agencies, owing to the scrutiny that came after the global economic downturn. Philippine manufacturing has rebounded, growing 10.8% in the second quarter of this year. We continue to welcome record high numbers of tourists, and more investors from all over the world are placing their bets on the Filipino people. Of course, none of this is to say that our work is done. There are always challenges on the horizon. Among others, we are undergoing a systemic transformation of our public transport system and implementing a long-delayed modernization of our armed forces. With the peace talks between government and Muslim secessionists successfully concluded, the task of boosting up Muslim Mindanao so it can catch up with the rest of the country can begin. That is why, a few days before I left on this extended trip, I formally turned over to Congress a draft Bangsamoro Basic Law, which, when passed, will be another significant milestone in our quest for peace and inclusiveness in the conflict-ridden, underdeveloped south of our country. The challenges will continue to come, but indeed, one can see how the questions have evolved. Once, when confronted with disaster, the question on government's minds was, how do we rebuild? Now the question we ask is, how do we build back better? Once the question on our people's minds was, is reform possible? Now the question they are asking is, how can we guarantee the permanence of reform? My entire life, I've witnessed my people do incredible things. They resisted the dictatorship, drove a peaceful revolution that captured the imagination of the world, stood firmly and often against tyranny and corruption whenever they reared their ugly heads, and worked tirelessly to put our country back on the map. For so long, we have endured the tyranny of self-serving administrations and the indifference of the world. But now, finally, my country, once an often overlooked archipelago in the Pacific, is poised to remain in the spotlight, as proof of what a mobilized citizenry and a government of integrity are capable of. Thank you for your patience, and good evening.